going to dive into our biblical Hebrew, the Hiphil stem strong verbs in chapter 26. We're also going to move, and I know you're going to love this, we're going to move at expeditious pace here and move into chapter 27 as well. So we're going to look at both the strong and the weak verb. I'm going to combine these two chapters in this lesson, so that we can, stay on schedule, and I'll talk more about that later. I want to, as we go into the Hiphil, we are now moving into our third stem, right? We started with the call stem, then we moved to the Niphal stem, and now the Hiphil stem. If you remember, the stems provide us, the root, we get our basic meaning, sort of core meaning out of a word. And then the stem and the conjugation together will give us our meaning and context. The stem provides us specifically, it shapes how that action works. And ultimately, in the cow stem, we see a sort of simple kind of action. And Hiphil is more causative, and that's what we're going to look at today. And the conjugation, whether it be the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, the infinite construct, the absolute construct, or the participle, gives us more an understanding of how the action as a whole, the action, how it's represented by the speaker. It's sort of called the aspectual aspect, and how the speaker is representing that action. For example, with the cow stem and the perfect conjugation, we'll have a simple kind of action that's more looking at the completed whole, whereas the imperfect conjugation with the cow stem would give us a simple kind of action that is an ongoing type of whole view, and that type of thing. So in the Hiphil, we're moving to look at causative kind of action. So whereas in the cow you might have he wrote, in the Hiphil we're going to be looking more at he caused someone to write. And we'll see that play out. Let me bring that out specifically in one perspective here. When we look at in Genesis 15 and verse 6, in 15 and verse 6 there, and speaking, this is the context of where Abram he's an older man. He and Sarai are older couple, and no children as of yet. The promise has been made to him back in Genesis 12, that God would bring a seed, a nation, and a land. None of those have been come to fruition as at that point. None of them have been completed. And so in this context, God approaches him, and Abram asks about the promise of a son, or a promise of a nation, the promise of the seed. And Abram points to his servant, says, "Look, here he is." And God says, "No, he will not be the promise." And so the result is that God takes him out in Genesis 15 verse 6 and shows him to look at the stars, and tells him that his descendants will be as great as the stars, the number as many of the stars. And so and the passage there says about Abram, it says, "And he believed in the Lord." The word believed is che'emin, excuse me, and he is a Hiphil. And this Hiphil is causative. And so this matters because Abram didn't just sort of drift into belief. He didn't just sort of wake up thinking, okay, I feel more confident now about God. But he caused himself to regard God as trustworthy. He caused himself, he focused himself to accept dependence upon God. And nothing in his circumstances made that easy. As we mentioned, he was older. Sarai was barren, no children as of yet. The promises that God had made had seemed unrealistic. I think all of us from time to time are have an expectation, and over time you find out and wonder about, is this expectation going to come to fruition? Is this going to happen? And we get less and less confident, or maybe doubts creep in. And so true with Abram, true with Sarai, of course. And it might seem unrealistic, and so Abram is bringing in his own solution to the promise. The same thing, of course, with others. Oftentimes, would bring in their own solution. Jacob did the same thing, and anyway, it's a different story. So Abram really had two options when he looked upon the stars. He could interpret God's view and say, "Look upon the stars," and he could interpret from through his own biology that he would do this, that through his abilities he would make the descendants as great as the stars. Or he could interpret the biology that his ability would occur through the promise. In other words, he would choose to put his emphasis, his focus, his dependence upon God versus his dependence upon himself. In other words, so he chose, of course, to put his dependence upon the promise, and he stayed. When you see him, he stays in the land. He kept walking with God. He didn't abandon the relationship, and so belief wasn't just something he internalized. It was something that he chose to shape as a direction that he's moving, regardless of his circumstances. And so faith is a chosen dependence that's expressed in action. And so the Hiphil here, the causative mode, I think it's amazing that he believed him. And when he said he believed him, he caused himself to accept, to trust, to put his dependency on God. If we think about it from this perspective, we should always be in sort of the Hiphil mode, in that every day you cause our heart to focus somewhere, right? Our heart can focus on fear, on what's happening in our lives or circumstances, the lack of control. Our heart can focus on the inability to make things happen. Our heart can focus on self-reliance to make things happen, and of course, frustration when it doesn't. Or we could put our dependence in our heart and focus on toward God. You see, that's a Hiphil kind of action. We're going to cause ourselves to look in this direction and to continue in this direction. So when you think about it, faith is not necessarily the absence of doubt. Doubt exists all the time, but it's the decision about which voice in our lives wins when doubt speaks up. Is it my voice in that my insecurities or my perspective? Is it something I'm self-reliant on, or is it something that I choose to put reliance upon God? And Abram caused himself he chose, in other words, to stand on God's word. And the question is very simple. What are we causing our heart to treat as solid ground today? What is it? Is it ourselves? Or are we choosing Hiphil, causing our heart to choose dependence upon God, regardless of the circumstances around us?